The sun goes down over a neighborhood just outside of ancient Rome around 2,000 years ago, and the city doesn't really go to sleep. Instead, it changes. The nice, proper people, like shopkeepers, important leaders called senators, and people doing business with each other, all go inside and shut their doors. Then something very different takes over the streets, the eating and drinking places, the bad houses, and the dark spots between them. This is not the Rome you see in pictures with big white columns and fancy victory arches. This is the Rome that writers from back then talked about quietly and sometimes with real anger. The Rome that people scratched words and drawings onto the walls of two cities called Pompeii and Herculaneum. And when a volcano exploded, it covered everything and kept those walls perfectly preserved, like a bug stuck in tree sap forever. This is the Rome that smelled like open, dirty ditches, cheap wine, meat being cooked, and people who were really struggling. And, depending on how you look at it, it was either the most exciting or the most disgusting place in the whole ancient world. So let's walk into it together. Let's look at exactly what went on after dark in the neighborhoods just outside Rome, in the areas called the Suburbium, which were the places just past the city walls where the rules weren't as strict, where nobody was really watching, and where the night felt a lot longer than it did in the fancier parts of the city. The first thing you'd notice is how loud it is. Roman cities were super noisy during the day. A famous leader named Julius Caesar, when he was in charge of Rome, actually said that wagons with wheels weren't allowed in the middle of the city during the day because the sound of wheels rolling over stone was driving everyone crazy. So those same wagons, banned during the day, rolled through the streets at night instead, and the sound of iron wheels clanking on stone roads, people shouting, animals making noise, whips cracking, and the general craziness of a city getting its supplies delivered in the dark was always in the background, no matter what else was going on. But on top of all that noisy work stuff, there were sounds that were more human and, honestly, kind of creepy. The nighttime in Rome belonged to people who didn't really fit into the daytime world, people who used to be slaves but were now free, trying to survive in a world that said they were free but gave them almost no way to make money. People from all over the huge Roman Empire who had moved to Rome and were packed into the cheapest homes the outer neighborhoods had. Criminals who walked around pretty confidently because the city's version of police, a group called the Vigils, who were also basically a fire department and a night watch at the same time, couldn't really stop them. The streets after dark in a Roman neighborhood weren't dangerous in a movie kind of way, where there's a big, dramatic fight. They were dangerous in a more everyday, quiet way, where things could go wrong slowly and leave almost no evidence behind. The Vigils, even though they had official power, only had about 7,000 workers for the whole city of Rome, which had maybe 1 million people living in it. And they really cared most about fires, which in a city packed with tall wooden apartment buildings was a truly terrifying problem that could wipe out whole neighborhoods. Smaller crimes, getting beat up, and all the shady business of nighttime were mostly left to sort themselves out. The Roman eating and drinking place, called a thermopolium, was the most important part of nightlife in any neighborhood, and the ones that were open after dark were very different from the ones open during the day. People digging through the ruins of Pompeii have found more than 80 of these food places in a city that probably had around 11,000 people living in it, which tells you just how important eating and drinking together was to how Romans lived their lives. But the nighttime thermopolium did more than just serve food and wine. They were also places where people gambled, where groups called collegia would meet up, and these groups were kind of like trade unions, but also like social clubs and protection groups all mixed together, made up of workers, freed slaves, and immigrants. These places were where people shared information, paid back debts, found work, and made the kinds of deals that couldn't be done out in the open during the day. The Roman government was really suspicious of these collegia groups because they brought together exactly the kind of people: the poor, the ones who moved around a lot, the ones without strong family connections, that the Roman system was most scared of as a group that could cause political trouble.
The wine they served in these places deserves its own little explanation. because it was nothing like what we think of when we hear the word wine today. Roman wine was almost always mixed with water. Drinking it straight without water was seen as something only wild people, or really desperate people, would do, and even the watered-down version usually had extra stuff mixed into it, ranging from just weird to actually scary. Salt water from the sea was added to help keep it from going bad. Something called lead acetate, which you made by boiling grape juice in pots made of lead, was used to make it sweeter, and this was done so often that scientists today think that many Roman wine drinkers probably got slowly poisoned by the lead over time. Raisins, herbs, spices, and honey were normal things to add, and cheaper drinking places sometimes threw in other stuff that was really hard to describe. A Roman writer named Pliny the Elder, who actually died while going to look at the volcano that buried Pompeii, and who wrote a huge book about the natural world, made a long, tired list of everything people put in wine, like someone who had seen way too much. Drinking wine in a cheap Roman bar at night was basically a science experiment as much as it was a social activity. And then there were the prostitutes, and this is the part where the Roman nighttime shows us the most about what was really broken in Roman society. Selling sex in Rome was legal, the government collected taxes from it, and it was organized into different levels the way Romans organized pretty much everything. At the top were fancy women called courtesans, who were educated, expensive, sometimes very powerful, and who operated in the world of rich and important men, and had almost nothing in common with the street-level reality. At the bottom were the women and men who worked the streets and the cheaper houses in the outer neighborhoods, and their lives weren't written about in fancy books, but showed up instead in wall graffiti, legal records, and the physical buildings where they worked. In Pompeii, the city's biggest known brothel had tiny stone rooms that were barely big enough to fit a small bed, with painted pictures above each door showing what you could pay for inside. The women who worked there were almost all slaves, or women who used to be slaves with no other way to survive, working inside a system that gave them legal protection from absolutely nothing. The Roman rules around selling sex were a perfect example of the kind of double standard that kept showing up in Roman history like a crack running through a marble floor. Selling sex was legal and totally accepted for the men who paid for it, but the women who provided it were labeled Infames, which meant they were officially stripped of the legal rights and social standing that free Roman citizens were supposed to have. They couldn't marry a Roman citizen, they couldn't speak up in court, and they were put in the same legal bucket as gladiators and actors, meaning people whose bodies were basically entertainment for the public, and who lost their standing as full people under the law just because of what they did. The streets themselves after midnight in the outer neighborhoods of Rome were a world of sharp differences. Rich Romans going from one fancy dinner party to another rode in chairs carried by slaves, surrounded by people holding torches who were basically serving as both flashlights and bodyguards at the same time. Poor people walked through the dark streets on foot, sharing the road with the waste that people upstairs would dump out of their windows all through the night. A Roman writer named Juvenal, who wrote in the early 100s AD, described what it was like to walk through Rome's streets at night with so much anger that it still hits hard even 2,000 years later. He listed all the dangers with a dark kind of humor, like chamber pots being dumped from above, drunk people picking fights, and the ceilings of apartment buildings falling in because the landlords built them cheaply and never fixed anything. His version of nighttime Rome is a city that is basically attacking the bodies of the people who live in it. The apartment buildings themselves, called insulae, were the most common kind of building in the outer neighborhoods of Rome, and they were some of the most dangerous buildings in the whole ancient world. Some of them were 6 or 7 stories tall, built from a mix of stone, brick, and wood, and packed with people who cooked food over open fires in rooms that had no chimneys. and they caught fire so regularly that historians like Livy wrote about it over and over with the kind of tired familiarity you get when something bad happens all the time. The bottom floor of a nicer apartment building might have a food place or a workshop in it, with the better-off tenants on the lower floors and the poorest people stuffed into the top floors, which were the hardest to escape from when fire started below. The Roman night was also, in a surprising way, a place where real culture and creativity were alive and happening. Street performers, acrobats, musicians, people who told stories, astrologers, and people who practiced what Roman law called magic, all worked after dark in the spaces between the food places and the brothels, drawing in crowds of people who had worked 12-hour days and found in the nighttime entertainment the only free time their whole lives gave them. The poor people of Rome weren't just helpless victims of everything around them. They built real communities, celebrated parties and holidays together, kept up religious practices centered around gods they kept in their homes and shrines in their neighborhoods, and created a whole social world that was actually pretty rich, even within the limits of being really, really poor. This is the detail that most popular stories about Roman nightlife completely miss because they're too busy focusing on the gross parts and the bad stuff. The people who lived in the Roman suburban night weren't just suffering through it. They were actually living in it, with all the jokes, creativity, friendship, and toughness that people always bring to even the hardest situations. The wall writings found in Pompeii are full of funny jokes, love notes, mean political comments, and the kind of small bragging that suggests people who were actually engaged with their lives rather than completely beaten down by them. What the Roman suburban night really shows us, when you look at all of it, is not just a story about how disgusting and immoral ancient people were. It's a story about what happens at the bottom of any society built on inequality after the people at the top have gone to bed. The deals that can't be made in daylight, the freedoms that only show up in the dark, the communities that come together specifically because they've been left out of the respectable world, and the very human insistence on finding fun, connection, and meaning, even in the worst situations that history has ever put people through. The little torches in the alleyways flickered and faded. The wine tasted terrible, and the beds were even worse. The night watchmen walked their routes and mostly pretended not to see anything. And in the tight little streets between those tall apartment buildings, 10,000 people that history mostly forgot went about the business of simply being alive, as loudly, as messily, and as stubbornly human as anyone you have ever met in your life.